right, so up till now, our game is not actually particularly fun. And it's because we haven't enabled the repeatability. So we need our game to allow the user to guess the next letter and the next letter and keep going until they either die or they get to the solution. So in this case, the solution is aardvark. So I'm going to guess a letter, A, and that gets replaced in the correct positions. And now I'm allowed to guess again. And I'm going to keep going until I've filled out all of the characters. So I'm almost there, just need a K now, and we should complete the entire game. And it tells me that it's complete and that I've won, and the game finally ends and exits out of the loop. In order to achieve this and make our game more like a game, we have just one to do. Now, the idea here is you're going to use a while loop to let the user guess again after they've guessed before. Now, the loop should only stop once the user has guessed all of the letters in the chosen word, and this means that the display list should have no more blanks in it. And then at that point, you can tell them that they've won. Now, in order to do this, and as a quick hint, you might need to have a read of, again, the section which I'll link to in the course resources. And specifically, I want you to focus on this in keyword because we mentioned it previously in the course only briefly. So I want you to read through this part and see how that works because you'll need it in order to get this to work. Now, the other thing to remember is that you have the negation in Python. So you can say if something is not true, and then to do something or other. So the not is the negation, and this basically flips whatever is here. So it could be A equals 3 if not A greater than 1. So in this case, A is 3, 3 is greater than 1, so this becomes true. But because there's a not in front of it, then this entire thing becomes false. And so this if statement won't be carried out in this case. But if this was 0 and 0 is not greater than 1, so this is now false, and not false becomes true, and now this if statement will be carried out. So that's how you use the negation. And finally, you might need to remind yourself of what we learned in yesterday's lessons and how the while loop works. Essentially, you want to be able to get this part to repeat itself again and again and again until all the blanks in the display is gone and they're filled. And at that point, the user has won. And remember, you don't have to worry about punishing the user for wrong answers just yet. We're going to do that in the next step. But for now, focus on this one to do and see if you can solve this challenge. All right, so let's go through the solution together. Now, we know that the part that we need repeating is this part, where we ask the user to guess a letter again and again until they filled out all the blanks in this display. The first step is to wrap a while loop around this block of code. So we can select the entire block of code and you can either indent it individually or just select all of it and hit Command and the right square bracket. And that will shift everything by one indentation level, and that effectively puts it inside our while loop. So now we have to define our while loop. So while something is true or while something is false, repeat this code again and again. So what exactly is our condition? We know that we only want our loop to end once there are no more blanks contained inside the list called display. Why don't we create a variable which we'll call end of game and set that to false to begin with because it's not yet the end of the game. And while it's not yet at the end of game, so while this is false, so you can either say while end of game is equal to false, or alternatively, and I think slightly easier to read, is you could say while it's not at the end of the game, Then repeat this continuously. Now, if we were to run our code right now, it would actually loop on until forever. It would not stop because nowhere in our code do we actually flip the switch and change this to true. So when is it actually the end of the game? Well, it's when display has no more blanks. So why don't we check at the very end after we've printed the display to see if blanks are not in display. So remember, this in keyword comes from Python, and it basically allows us to check to see if a particular element exists inside a particular list. So in this case, we're checking if curly exists in list, and there it is. I can see it as one of the elements. So this is going to be true. Now, if blank in list is no longer true, well, that means that we've gotten rid of all the blanks and we replace them with letters that the user has guessed. So now this is the condition for the user having won. So we can flip the end of game to true, and this will mean that this is the last time our while loop is going to run, and we're going to print you win. That's it. That's all we needed to do. And if it's helpful, you can again take this code, put it into Thonny, and run through it using the debug step by step to see what it's doing. Now, the important thing here is to realize that while statements require some sort of change to happen inside the while loop that changes the condition that the while loop is dependent upon, and it means that the code exits the while loop. So in this case, it's when there are no longer any more blanks inside the display list. But in later steps, we're going to change that so that when the users run out of lives, then it's also going to be the end of the game and they will have lost. So take a moment, review this lesson, make sure you understand everything that's going on, then head over to the next lesson and we'll tackle the next step. Well done for getting to step 4. Now, in this step, when you take a look at the starting file, you'll see that I've incorporated a bunch of ASCII art, so art that's created using strokes of the keyboard. And you can see that this represents the stages of our hangman game, starting from where they have all 6 lives and then going down in lives until they have no more lives, where the hangman character is complete. This has been included as a list, and inside the list, each of these pieces of art is a single string. So we're going to be printing it out in this step, and we're going to be using it to give the user feedback. So the to-dos for step 4 include creating a variable called lives to keep track of the number of lives, and lives should be equal to 6. Now in the next to-do, we're checking to see if the guess is actually not a letter in the chosen word. Then we're going to reduce that variable lives by 1. So eventually it's going to step down all the way to 0, and when that happens, the game should stop and it should print you lose. Now this part is really important because we want the game to stop when the lives has gone down to 0. So the code should exit the while loop and print you lose. So in addition to winning as a condition to ending the game, losing is also a condition for ending the game. Now the final to do is just to print the ASCII art from stages, which is this list up here, and the stage should represent the current number of lives the user has remaining. So this way, when we actually play the game and we get all the letters wrong, each time a new piece of the hangman is going to be drawn until eventually we end up with the entire drawing complete and the game ends and it tells us that we lost. If it's helpful, refer to the flowchart, and once you're ready, go ahead and fork this starting code and tackle the to-dos one by one. Good luck, and I'll see you on the other side. Alright, so make sure you've given it a good go before you come over here because I'm about to reveal the solution. In terms of step 4, here I've got a forked copy of the code, And if I scroll down to to-do number 1, this is pretty simple. It just tells us to create a new variable called lives, and this variable is going to be the one that's going to keep track of the number of lives the user has left. And to start off, it's going to be equal to 6. Now we move on to to-do number 2, and it tells us that if the guess is not a letter in the chosen word, then we have to reduce the number of lives by 1. Now, it might be really tempting to put this as an else statement here, because if the letter is equal to guess, then, well, obviously it matches. Well, then else, that means it doesn't match. But check out what happens here if I just print a simple statement. So now if I hit run, and we take a look on the right side, you can see that if I guess A, then you can see that we get no match printed 5 times. And that should show you that this is actually not where we want to write the code for to-do number 2. Because remember, to-do number 2 says if the guessed letter is not a letter in the chosen word, then we should reduce the lives by 1. But actually, in fact, what's happening here is it's looping through the entire word length, and for each of the letters in that chosen word, if the letter doesn't match the guess, then it's going to trigger this else statement. This is not what we want, because in this case, A does in fact match a letter in the word baboon, but we're getting no match being called 5 times. So instead, we want to write it outside of the for loop, so at the same indentation level. And the hint is that the to-do is actually at the same level as where your answer code needs to go. So here, we're going to write an if statement, and we're going to check if the guess is not in the chosen word. And basically, this does a separate check. It goes through this entire word and checks if the guessed letter exists in there at all. And if this is true, then we're going to reduce the number of lives by 1. So minus equals 1. Now, if at this stage, after we've taken a life away and the number of lives goes down to 0, well, then the game should stop and it should print you lose. So let's add another if statement in here that checks whether if the number of lives is equals to, double equal to 0. And if this is the case, then we should exit the game. And remember, to do that, we need to exit the while loop. And the while loop is dependent on this variable end of game, which starts out being false. And when we want to exit the game, when it is in fact the end of the game, we switch it to true. Like, for example, in this case, when the user has won. So here, when the lives is equal to 0, we can say end of game equals true. And we're going to print you lose. So that's all that's needed to tackle to-do number 2. So now let's run our code again. And you can see that if I keep guessing the wrong letter 6 times, then eventually I exit out of my while loop. You can see my prompt showing up again. And this means that we've now come out of the game and it's told us that we've lost. So now all we have to do is tackle to-do number 3. We have to print the ASCII art from the list called stages that corresponds to the current number of lives the user has remaining. Now, luckily for you, I've arranged each of these pictures in descending order of lives. So when you have a full 6 lives, the image at index 6 is the starting image. And when you have no lives, so the image at index 0 is the one where the hangman is fully drawn. So all we have to do down here is to simply just print the stages and corresponding to the current number of lives. So we put lives inside the square brackets. And now if we run the code again and we keep guessing, you can see that we're going through our hangman picture until we are fully drawn and we lose, and it's the end of the game. Have a quick review of the solution. And if you want to see this code that I've written, then as always, head over to the course resources and you'll find a link to day 7, Hangman 4 End. And you'll be able to see all the code that I've written in there including helpful things like a print statement that you can activate, which just shows you the current position, the current letter, and the letter that's being guessed. So you can see as the loop is going on what's actually happening. And it'll make it easier for you to debug any problems in your code. So if you had any problems in the code that you wrote, this is a really useful line to be able to help you debug what's gone wrong. Hopefully you managed to do this okay, and once you've had a quick review and you're happy with everything that's been covered in this lesson, then head over to the next lesson and we're going to complete the final step, step 5 of our Hangman project. Hey, well done for getting to the final step of the Hangman project. Now in step 5, we're going to complete the project by improving the user experience of our game. Pretty much up until now, we've already got the game functioning, but we were working with just 3 words, right? Aardvark, baboon, and camel. And at some point, the game gets pretty tiring when you're only guessing these 3 words. And in fact, the words were chosen so that if you see 7 characters and you know it's aardvark, 6 is baboon, 5 is camel, to make it easier for you to debug the code as you're creating it. And very often when we're writing code, it's really, really important to help yourself when you're creating the code. And only once you've got all the logic down and everything's working as expected, then to actually add the full functionality. So inside the step 5 starting code, if you take a look at the files over here, you'll notice 2 extra files. One is hangman_art.py, and here I've moved the hangman stages and all the drawings, as well as a logo in ASCII art. So when we actually launch our game this time, then we're going to get the hangman logo printed out like this at the beginning of the game. Now, the second file here is hangman_words, and this word list now expands on what we had before, and it's now a huge list of words assorted alphabetically, which we're going to draw upon and replace this previous very simple word list. The first to do is to update the word list to use the one from here instead of this one. So deleting this line and replacing it with that. And to do this, you might have to look up on previous lessons. We talked about how to use modules in Python and how to import different files. Now, if you get stuck on how to do that, take a look inside the course resources and there's hints that take you towards documentation on how to do this. Now, once you've tackled to-do number 1, scroll all the way down to find to-do number 2, where we're going to import the stages from Hangman Art, and this is the same thing using modules and import. To-do number 3 is to import the logo. So 1, 2, 3 are all to do with modules and import. And then once you get to to-do number 4, we're basically going to improve the user experience to let the user know that they've entered a letter that they've already guessed before. And when that happens, we're going to print the letter and just let them know. You don't have to punish them, and you don't have to take away a life, and you don't have to restart the game. It's just a gentle nudge and let them know that they've already guessed that letter. Now on to-do number 5 and the final to-do, we're going to let the user know if the letter that they guessed is not in the chosen word. So in this case, we're going to print out the letter that they guessed and let them know that it's not in the word. Just a little bit of feedback to make the game a little bit easier on the user. So once you've done all of that, then you should end up with a game that's like this. So because there's so many words, I think it's really, really important that you actually have this line of testing code to tell you what the solution actually is, so you can test all parts of your game because you know what the word actually should be. So let's guess a letter that's not in that word. Let's try A. And you can see the game tells us you guessed the letter A. That's not in the word, you lose a life. And we end up with the head already drawn in the Hangman. So now let's guess a different letter. Let's guess, say T. Then you can see that works as expected, but what if we try guessing T again? Well, then it tells us you've already guessed T, and it shows us the blanks, including the T. Now, if they guess a letter that's actually not in the word, so say A, well, in this case, they're going to lose a life because it's actually not in the word, and we're going to take away a life. So have a play around with the end version of the game. And as always, all the links are in the course resources. And once you're ready, then go ahead and fork the starting file and give this a go. All right, so let's go through the solution together for this final step. The first step tells us to update the word list to use the word list from hangman_words. And it's actually got exactly the same name, so we don't even have to change it all that much. But what we do have to do is to make this error go away. If you haven't already, go ahead and delete this line in your code where you've got the word list using the previous 3 words. And instead, we're going to import the hangman_words. And now we should be able to tap into this word list by writing hangman_words.wordlist. And this is the same way that we use the random module. So we imported the random module, and then when we needed it, we simply said random.choice. So choice is a function inside the random module, and we can access it like so. Now, if you want it to be a little bit simpler in terms of the code that you write, and you don't want to rewrite hangman_words dot such and such, then instead of just importing hangman words, you can actually instead write from hangman words import the word list. So now we can get rid of this part and we can just use the previous code that we had on line 7. Using that, you can do the same thing for to-do number 2. From the hangman art, you can import the stages, and that will make this error go away. And for to-do number 3, you can again say from hangman art, import the logo. And then we can just print the logo. Now, notice how we're importing 2 different things from this same file, hangman art. So if you didn't want to write it twice, you can, in fact, also just say from hangman art import logo, comma, stages. And this will import both the logo and the stages, and you'll see that there's no errors down here. If that's at all confusing, be sure to read through the documentation that I've linked to in the course resources that talks all about Python modules and importing, so you can familiarize yourself with this once more. Now on to-do 4, we're going to check to see if the user has entered a letter that they've already guessed and it's a letter that they got right. Then we're going to print the letter and let them know. To do this, we're going to check through the display, which is a list of letters that they've already guessed. And we're going to check to see if the guess is in the display list. Well, in this case, they've already guessed that letter and it's a correct one. So we're just going to print out the feedback that you've already guessed, and then we'll put in their guess letter. Now, however, if the letter is not in the chosen word, then we're going to print out the letter and let them know that you guessed this particular letter. That's not in the word. You lose a life. That's it. That's all we had to do. And if we run our app as it is now, then you can see that the solution is stymied. So if we just check against S, then that's being added. And if we get a letter wrong, then we get told that's not in the word, you lose a life, and our hangman is being drawn out. And if we guess a correct letter that we've already guessed, like S again, then it tells us that you've already guessed that letter. Now, you can either choose to keep all of these print statements if it helps you understand what's going on, or alternatively, at this stage, it might make things a little bit confusing and you can just comment it out. Have a look at the final version by going to the course resources, where I'll link to the completed code that I've written here, and you can have a read through it and compare against yours. But essentially, this is all there is to this project, and you've now completed it in its entirety. Once you're happy with your code, go ahead and remove all the comments that are no longer useful, like all the to-dos and the testing code, because if you want to play the game for real, then that's just cheating. If you want to leave in some of the comments that lets you know what each part of the code does so that when you come back to it, it's easier to understand, then feel free to do that. But the final thing that I wanted to show you is, what if you wanted to be able to clear the screen after every answer? Because you can see that at some point you have to keep scrolling and it gets a little bit confusing as to which stage you're in. So one of the things that you can do is you can tap into the Replit module and you can import a function called clear. Once you've imported this clear function, then you can go ahead and add it just after the user has made their guess. So you can call it just as you would any other function now that you've imported it into this file. And when you run the code now, you can see that after every guess, it's going to clear the screen. So guess a letter, let's guess a different letter. And now that means we don't have this backlog of previous guesses, and we can actually see what's going on at each stage. In the course resources, you'll also find a link to the final completed code under Day 7 Hangman Final, and feel free to modify this code to your heart's content, make it do whatever it is that you want to do, and push the boundaries of your programming skills if you want to. Well done for getting this far, and well done for tackling this challenge. Rest easy, and I'll see you tomorrow.